And finally, at 3:47 p.m. on that Thursday, the call I'd been expecting since the news broke. "Sarah, it's Rebecca Martinez. I saw the news coverage this morning. Congratulations, that's quite an achievement. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss." I was standing in my new corner office on the 34th floor of GreenTech's Manhattan headquarters, looking down at the city where Morrison and Associates occupied 3 floors of a building that suddenly seemed much smaller from this height. Through my floor-to-ceiling windows, I could actually see the Morrison building 12 blocks away. A perfectly ironic #VP told me, "Stick to coffee runs." Then I launched the $50 million division. She rejected the elevator hummed as I balanced 3 lattes. And a stack of market research reports I'd compiled over the weekend. Floor 22 of Morrison and Associates, where dreams supposedly came true, if you were the right kind of person with the right kind of pedigree. I wasn't. I was Sarah Chen, a business analyst with an MBA from a state school, not Harvard. The daughter of first-generation immigrants who'd worked double shifts at their restaurant to pay for my education. I'd spent 2 years watching opportunities pass by while fetching coffee for executives who couldn't see past my title or my last name. Morrison and Associates was supposed to be different. A progressive consulting firm that valued diverse perspectives and innovative thinking, at least that's what their website claimed. The reality was starched shirts, old boys networks, and a glass ceiling so thick you could barely see through it, but this morning was different. Today, I had something that could change everything. 3 months of my own time, my own research, my own weekend nights spent building what I believed could transform not just Morrison, but the entire consulting industry's approach to emerging markets. The boardroom doors were already closed when I arrived. Through the glass, I could see VP Rebecca Martinez gesturing at a presentation slide, her perfectly manicured nails catching the light as she commanded the room's attention. The quarterly strategy meeting, the one I'd been preparing for without invitation. Rebecca was Morrison's golden child, hired 3 years ago from McKinsey with a Harvard MBA and a Rolodex full of Fortune 500 contacts. She wore her success like armor, designer suits, a corner office with Central Park views, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no by anyone who mattered. She'd built her reputation on safe bets and incremental improvements, never the revolutionary thinking Morrison claimed to value. Sarah, her assistant, David, waved me over nervously. He was only 2 years older than me but had learned to navigate corporate hierarchies with careful precision. "Just set those on the side table. They're deep into Q4 expansion strategies." Rebecca's presenting her 5-year growth plan. I placed the coffees down with deliberate care, arranging them exactly as each executive preferred. But instead of retreating to my invisible position, I cleared my throat. "Actually, I have something that might be directly relevant to the discussion." The room's energy shifted instantly. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Rebecca paused, her presentation clicker frozen mid-gesture, her ice blue eyes fixing on me with a mixture of surprise and territorial annoyance. "I'm sorry, what?" she said, her voice carrying the particular tone reserved for interruptions by people who weren't supposed to speak. "The untapped market in sustainable packaging solutions," I said, pulling out my research folder. "I've identified a $50 million opportunity that aligns perfectly with our current client base. 3 months of analysis, projected ROI of 340% within 2 years. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Rebecca, whose manicured fingers drummed against the mahogany table. I could see her calculating, not the merit of my proposal, but the audacity of my presence. "Sarah, I appreciate your enthusiasm," she said, the word dripping with condescension, "but we're handling strategic planning here. This is senior-level work. Perhaps you could focus on what you do best." My cheeks burned, but I'd come too far to back down. The consumer goods sector is pivoting toward eco-friendly packaging at 23% year-over-year growth. We have relationships with 16 companies in this space already. The infrastructure exists, we just need. I pulled out my client mapping chart, showing connection points between Morrison's existing accounts and potential sustainable packaging contracts. 3 months of cross-referencing databases, analyzing supply chains, identifying decision-makers. "Coffee runs," Rebecca interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Stick to coffee runs, Sarah. That's what we hired you for." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt 20 pairs of eyes avoiding mine, staring at laptops, phones, anywhere but at the woman being publicly humiliated. Senior partner James Morrison himself looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. The same man who'd given a speech last month about cultivating talent from within. Laughter rippled around the table, not cruel, but dismissive. The kind that erases you from the room while you're still standing in it. I felt my folder grow heavy in my hands, 3 months of weekend research reduced to nothing by 6 words. Right. I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Coffee runs. My mistake. As I turned to leave, I heard whispers, ambitious, but knows her place now. Poor thing, thought she could play with the big kids. Should have stayed in her lane. But as I left, I caught something in the reflection of the glass doors. Rebecca was already flipping through my research, her eyes scanning the pages with sudden interest. She read for 30 seconds, then slid the folder into her briefcase. When she thought no one was looking. That evening, I sat in my studio apartment in Queens, staring at backup copies of everything I'd given her spread across my small dining table. The market data, the client mapping, the financial projections, all of it born from nights spent in 24-hour coffee shops and weekends in the NYU Business Library, researching while my former classmates were building careers at firms that actually valued their contributions. My phone buzzed with a text from my college roommate Lisa. How did the big pitch go? Ready to celebrate your promotion? I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. It didn't go as planned. But even as I sent those words, something else was crystallizing in my mind. A quiet, determined thought that would change everything. If they won't let me build it here, I'll build it somewhere they can't ignore it. I opened my laptop and began documenting everything, not just the research I'd presented, but every interaction, every dismissal, every time my ideas had been overlooked or minimized. If Rebecca wanted to play corporate politics, she was about to learn that some people kept very detailed records. My parents called later that evening, their voices crackling through the phone from the restaurant where they were closing up for the night. How was work today, Sarah? My mother asked in Mandarin, the same question she'd asked every day since I started at Morrison. Challenging, I said, switching to English. I'd never told them about the coffee runs, the dismissals, the way my MBA seemed worthless in a world that valued connections over competence. They'd sacrificed too much for my education to burden them with the reality of corporate America. You work so hard, my father added. We're proud of you. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Their pride made my chest tight. They believed in the American dream because they'd lived it, 2 immigrants building a successful business through sheer determination. They'd given me opportunities they never had, and I was wasting them on people who would never see my value. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. 3 weeks after the coffee run comment, I was doing exactly what Rebecca suggested, but with a strategic twist. Every morning, I'd arrive at 6:30 a.m. to prepare the executive floor's beverages, learning each VP's preferences with meticulous detail. But I'd also arrive with something else, a carefully maintained intelligence network, from my invisible perch. At the coffee station, positioned perfectly between the elevator and the main conference rooms, I became Morrison's most informed observer. The executive floor's layout was my advantage, an open design that prioritized collaboration over privacy, meaning conversations carried farther than people realized. I watched deal after deal slip through their fingers while I memorized client names, contract values, and missed connections. More importantly, I began to understand the pattern. Morrison was trapped in its own success, too comfortable with traditional consulting to recognize that entire industries were being disrupted. The sustainable packaging opportunities weren't random inquiries, they were symptoms of a massive shift. Supply chain managers were panicking about new regulations. CFOs were trying to budget for packaging transitions they didn't understand. Marketing directors were being pressured to make sustainability claims they couldn't back up. Morrison was perfectly positioned to guide them through this transformation, but Rebecca's department treated each call like an isolated request instead of part of a larger market evolution. Another eco-packaging inquiry, I overheard Rebecca's assistant, Jennifer, mention during a phone call. Green tech industries. They mentioned a $12 million annual budget for packaging transformation consulting. Third call this week about similar projects. Should I route it to general services? Sure, came Rebecca's distracted voice from her office, where she was probably reviewing proposals for the same Fortune 500 companies Morrison had been serving for decades. We don't have bandwidth for niche markets right now. Focus on the established accounts. I made detailed notes in my encrypted phone app. Green tech industries, $12 million annual consulting budget, specialized in biodegradable packaging solutions, routed to generic consulting team with no sustainability expertise. Potential lost revenue. $2.4 million in annual fees, plus expansion opportunities. The next day brought BioCorp, seeking biodegradable alternatives for their $8 million product line launch targeting environmentally conscious consumers in the 18 to 34 demographic. Then EcoSoft, restructuring their entire $15 million packaging approach for European market compliance with extended producer responsibility regulations. Pacific Organic called about sustainable packaging consulting for their $25 million consumer goods expansion into Whole Foods and Target. Every single inquiry perfectly aligned with the research Rebecca had dismissed, then stolen. Every missed opportunity represented millions in lost revenue that Morrison desperately needed as their traditional consulting revenue flattened. The pattern continued. BioCorp, seeking biodegradable alternatives for their product lines. EcoSoft, launching a sustainable consumer goods division. Pacific Organic, restructuring their entire packaging approach. All of them perfectly aligned with the research Rebecca had dismissed. During lunch breaks, I started reaching out independently, carefully, strategically, and completely within legal boundaries. Not as a Morrison employee, which would violate my contract, but as a freelance researcher conducting academic market studies on sustainable business transformation. I registered a simple LLC for $200 and created professional business cards that listed me as an independent sustainability consultant. The conversations were more revelatory than I'd expected. These weren't companies looking for basic advice, they were sophisticated organizations facing complex challenges that required deep expertise. We've been burned by 3 different consulting firms, Marcus Thompson, COO of BioCorp, told me during our first call. They all promised sustainable packaging solutions, but when we dug into their proposals, it was clear they didn't understand the regulatory landscape, the supply chain implications, or the cost structures. One firm suggested biodegradable materials. That would have tripled our manufacturing costs and violated FDA guidelines for our products. This was exactly what my research had predicted. Companies weren't just looking for consultants who could create PowerPoint presentations about sustainability. They needed partners who understood that sustainable packaging was reshaping entire business models, forcing new relationships with manufacturers, requiring different financial planning, and creating competitive advantages for early adopters. Most firms talk about sustainability like it's a marketing trend, added Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Chief Innovation Officer at EcoSoft. They don't understand that we're looking at fundamental supply chain transformation. The regulatory environment in Europe is already forcing changes that will hit the US market within 2 years. We need advisors who can help us get ahead of that curve, not catch up to it. I began building something unprecedented, a comprehensive database of companies desperately seeking exactly what I'd proposed to Rebecca. But this wasn't just a list of missed opportunities, it was a detailed intelligence network that mapped the entire sustainable packaging ecosystem. By month 2, I had documented $73 million in potential contracts that had walked through Morrison's doors and been turned away. More importantly, I'd identified the specific pain points, budget ranges, and decision-making processes that traditional consulting firms were missing. This wasn't just market research, it was competitive intelligence that could reshape how consulting was delivered in emerging markets. Meanwhile, the cracks in Morrison's quarterly performance were becoming visible even from the coffee station. What started as whispered concerns in the break room had evolved into increasingly tense conversations that executives didn't bother to hide from support staff, a mistake that gave me unprecedented access to the firm's internal struggles. I overheard Senior Partner James Morrison on a heated phone call with the firm's biggest client. "We understand your disappointment with the market analysis deliverable. Yes, we can revise the recommendations, but we'll need to extend the timeline and adjust the fee structure." Later that same week, I watched Rebecca emerge from a closed-door meeting with the other VPs, her usual composure cracked enough to reveal the stress underneath. She spent the next hour making urgent phone calls to potential clients, her voice carrying a desperation that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. The administrative assistants knew everything, and they talked more freely around me than they realized. During coffee breaks, I heard about delayed bonuses, deferred hiring, and the growing pressure from Morrison's board to find new revenue streams. Traditional consulting margins were shrinking as clients demanded more specialized expertise and faster turnaround times. "Rebecca's been working weekends for 3 straight months," Jennifer confided to another assistant while I refilled the coffee supplies nearby. "She keeps saying we need a breakthrough client or project to turn things around. The partners are asking hard questions about her department's performance." The irony was almost beautiful. Rebecca was struggling to find the growth opportunities that companies like GreenTech, BioCorp, and EcoSoft had been offering Morrison for months. She was losing sleep over revenue problems that my dismissed research could have solved immediately, but the most telling moment came during a conference call I overheard while cleaning the boardroom after hours. Rebecca was presenting to a potential client, and I recognized the sustainable packaging talking points immediately. they were mine, lifted directly from the research she'd stolen and repackaged as Morrison's strategic insight. We've identified sustainable packaging as a high-growth consulting vertical, she said, reading from what sounded like my own analysis. Our preliminary research suggests significant market opportunities for companies that move early on regulatory compliance and supply chain transformation. The potential client's response was devastating. That's interesting, but we've already engaged with a specialist who really understands this space. Someone who's been studying sustainable packaging transformation for months, not weeks. We need advisors who were ahead of the curve, not catching up to it. Rebecca called an all-hands meeting 6 weeks after our boardroom encounter. She stood at the front of the main conference room, her usual confidence slightly frayed around the edges. I noticed she was wearing the same navy blazer she'd worn during my humiliation, a detail that felt almost poetic. Q4 projections are below target by 18%, she announced, clicking through slides that looked suspiciously familiar. We need to be more aggressive about identifying growth opportunities. I want everyone thinking outside their current scope, looking for emerging markets that align with our core competencies. From the back of the room, where I stood with the other support staff, I watched her deliver the exact message I'd tried to give her 3 months earlier. The irony was so sharp it took everything in me not to laugh out loud, but then she clicked to the next slide, and my blood went cold. It was my market segmentation analysis, the exact chart from my stolen research folder, but with Morrison branding and Rebecca's name in the bottom corner as lead analyst. Sustainable packaging represents a significant opportunity, she continued, reading directly from my conclusions word for word. Initial research suggests potential revenues in excess of $40 million within our existing client base, with particularly strong opportunities in biodegradable alternatives and regulatory compliance. Consulting. She was presenting my work. My 3 months of weekend research, my client mapping, my financial projections, my regulatory analysis, all of it repackaged as Morrison's strategic initiative under her leadership. The audience was nodding approvingly at insights I'd developed. While they were dismissing me as a coffee-fetching nobody, the presentation continued for 20 minutes, each slide a masterclass in intellectual theft. My supply chain analysis became Morrison's proprietary methodology. My client relationship mapping was now strategic partnership identification. Even my timeline projections and budget estimates had been seamlessly integrated into Rebecca's narrative, but the most infuriating part was watching her field questions about the research. When senior partner Michael Warren asked about regulatory timelines in California, Rebecca gave a confident but completely wrong answer that showed she hadn't actually understood the nuances of my analysis. She was performing expertise she didn't possess, using insights she couldn't replicate. After the meeting, I lingered in the break room and overheard the partners' conversation. Rebecca's finally hitting her stride, James Morrison said. This sustainable packaging initiative could be exactly what we need to diversify our revenue streams. The analysis was surprisingly sophisticated, added Michael Warren. Much more detailed than her usual work. She must have really dug deep on this one. I felt sick. Not just because of the theft, but because of how easily the firm's leadership was willing to believe that Rebecca had suddenly developed expertise in a field she dismissed as a niche market. Just months earlier, after the meeting, I overheard Rebecca talking to the senior partners. We're missing something. Client inquiries are up, but conversion rates are down. There's a disconnect somewhere. That evening, I opened my laptop and began drafting something I'd been thinking about for weeks, a business plan. Not for Morrison and Associates, but for Chen Strategic Solutions, a boutique firm specializing in sustainable business transformation. I had the market research, the client connections, and most importantly, the knowledge that there was a $50 million opportunity just waiting for someone brave enough to grab it. The only question was whether I had the courage to leave the safety of coffee runs for the uncertainty of building something entirely my own. The call came on a Tuesday morning. While I was preparing Rebecca's usual oat milk latte, extra hot, 2 pumps vanilla, a drink order I could recite in my sleep, my personal phone buzzed against my hip, not the office line, which meant someone had found my direct number. Sarah Chen? This is Patricia Williams from Meridian Capital Group. We've been hearing about your work in sustainable packaging solutions from some mutual contacts. Are you available for a conversation? I nearly dropped the coffee cup. Meridian Capital, one of the largest investment firms on the West Coast, known for backing transformative business models and disruptive market entries. I stepped into the empty conference room and closed the door, my heart hammering. I'm not sure what you mean, I said carefully, though my mind was racing through possibilities. Who had mentioned my name? How had word of my independent research reached one of the most exclusive investment firms in the country? Marcus Thompson at BioCorp mentioned you've been conducting some fascinating market research. He said you understood the sustainable packaging landscape better than anyone he'd spoken with, including several major consulting firms. We're looking for a lead consultant on due diligence for a major portfolio acquisition in this space. 8-figure investment, potentially 9 if the targets meet our criteria. The pieces started clicking together. Marcus must have mentioned our conversation to other executives who'd shared my insights in their own networks. In the small world of sustainable business transformation, word traveled fast about people who actually understood the complexities. The room seemed to spin slightly. When would you need this completed? 2 weeks for initial assessment, then ongoing partnership if the deal moves forward. We're prepared to offer $75,000 for the consulting engagement, with equity participation if you help us structure the acquisition properly. But Sarah, I should be direct, we're not looking for surface-level analysis. We need someone who can identify acquisition targets, assess integration challenges, and develop post-acquisition growth strategies. This is senior-level strategic work. Senior-level strategic work. The phrase Rebecca had used to dismiss me was now being offered by someone who actually understood what I was capable of delivering. We've seen too many consultants who talk a good game about emerging markets but can't deliver actionable intelligence, Patricia continued. Marcus showed us some of your preliminary analysis, and frankly, it's more sophisticated than what we've gotten from firms charging 10 times as much. I stared through the glass at Rebecca's office, where she was gesturing animatedly on a phone call, probably discussing Morrison's disappointing quarterly numbers while sitting on stolen research. That could have transformed their entire business model. The irony was almost poetic. While she was presenting my ideas to Morrison's leadership, the market was already moving past them toward people who could actually execute those ideas. I stared through the glass at Rebecca's office, where she was gesturing animatedly on a phone call, probably discussing Morrison's disappointing quarterly numbers. I'd be very interested, I said. That afternoon, I submitted my 2 weeks' notice in writing, as professionally as I could manage. Rebecca's expression when I handed her the letter was a masterpiece of corporate composure barely containing genuine shock. This is rather sudden, Sarah. Is there something we could have done differently? A promotion path you'd like to discuss? I almost mentioned the coffee run comment, the dismissed research, the stolen presentation slides I'd watched her deliver. Instead, I simply said, I've decided to pursue opportunities that better align with my expertise and career goals. She set the letter aside with practiced indifference, but I caught her glancing at it twice during our brief conversation. Well, she said finally, I'm sure you'll do well in whatever you're planning. Administrative work can be quite fulfilling. Even now, she couldn't resist one final dismissal. I smiled politely and left her office, knowing it would be the last time I'd ever need to perform that particular dance of corporate servility. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation and secret triumph. I worked the Meridian project from my studio apartment, diving deep into market analysis, regulatory frameworks, and implementation strategies. Everything I'd been developing in secret suddenly had a real-world application worth more than my annual salary. The data told an even more compelling story than I'd originally realized. Sustainable packaging wasn't just growing, it was becoming mandatory through a complex web of regulations, consumer pressure, and corporate sustainability commitments that would reshape multiple industries simultaneously. New regulations in California and New York were forcing major retailers to adopt eco-friendly alternatives by 2026, with penalties reaching millions of dollars for non-compliance. European markets were already operating under extended producer responsibility laws that made manufacturers financially liable for packaging waste throughout the entire product lifecycle. China had banned most single-use plastics, creating massive disruption in global supply chains, but the real opportunity was in the companies that understood this transition early. My analysis showed that first movers in sustainable packaging could capture market share not just through regulatory compliance, but through cost advantages, supply chain resilience, and brand differentiation that traditional competitors couldn't match. The Meridian project became the most intellectually challenging work I'd ever done. They wanted me to evaluate 12 potential acquisition targets across 6 countries, assess regulatory risks in multiple jurisdictions, and develop integration strategies that could scale across their entire portfolio. This wasn't just consulting, it was strategic advisory work at the highest level. Working from my studio apartment, I built financial models that projected revenue growth, conducted regulatory analysis across multiple markets, and developed competitive intelligence profiles on companies that most people had never heard of but would dominate the industry within 5 years. Every night, I'd work until 2 a.m., surrounded by printouts of SEC filings, industry reports, and regulatory documents. My dining table became a command center covered with market maps, competitor analysis, and integration timelines. This was what I'd been training for, not fetching coffee or managing administrative tasks, but solving complex business problems that required deep analytical thinking and strategic insight. The final presentation to Meridian's investment committee was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not a humiliating performance in front of people who'd already decided I didn't belong, but a genuine conversation with individuals who understood the value of insight and expertise. 37 slides of pure strategic analysis, backed by months of research they didn't know I'd been conducting while fetching lattes and absorbing corporate slights. I presented market segmentation, competitive landscape analysis, regulatory impact assessments, and financial projections that painted a picture of not just opportunity, but inevitability. This level of analysis is exceptional, Patricia Williams said afterward, reviewing the bound report I'd prepared. Most consulting firms give us surface-level trend analysis. This is actionable intelligence. We'd like to retain Chin Strategic Solutions as our primary consultant for the entire sustainable transformation vertical. Chin Strategic Solutions. My own company, born from coffee runs and humiliation, now being courted by one of the most influential investment firms in the country. Within 6 months, my one-person consultancy had grown to a team of 8 specialists. BioCorp became our anchor client with a $3.2 million annual contract, followed by EcoSoft, $1.8 million, Pacific Organic, $2.1 million, and 14 other companies Morrison had turned away. Each new client felt like vindication, but also like proof of concept for something bigger. We weren't just winning individual contracts, we were building a new model for how consulting could work in rapidly evolving markets. Instead of the traditional approach of applying generic frameworks to specific problems, we developed deep expertise in transformation patterns that could be adapted across multiple industries. BioCorp became our anchor client with a $3.2 million annual contract that expanded their packaging transformation across 14 product lines. They were so impressed with our regulatory analysis that they hired us to guide their expansion into European markets, where our understanding of extended producer responsibility laws saved them millions in compliance costs. EcoSoft followed with a $1.8 million engagement that grew into a 3-year strategic partnership. We didn't just help them redesign their packaging, we restructured their entire supply chain to take advantage of emerging sustainable materials that weren't yet widely available. When their main competitor struggled with packaging compliance issues 6 months later, EcoSoft captured a $45 million contract they never could have won without our early guidance. Pacific Organic's $2.1 million project became a case study in how sustainability consulting could drive revenue growth, not just cost management. We identified packaging innovations that actually reduced their material costs while improving shelf appeal, helping them secure premium placement in Target and Whole Foods that generated an additional $12 million in annual revenue. But the real breakthrough came when 14 other companies Morrison had turned away started reaching out through referrals. These weren't random inquiries, they were sophisticated organizations that had been watching our work and waiting for the right partner to help them navigate the sustainable transition. Word was spreading in the industry about a consultancy that actually understood sustainable business transformation, not just the buzzwords. Supply chain executives were sharing our case studies in industry conferences. Procurement officers were recommending us to their networks. Regulatory affairs managers were citing our analysis in internal presentations. The breakthrough moment came during a video call with Greentecha's board of directors, the same company that had called Morrison 9 months earlier asking for sustainable packaging consulting and been routed to General Services. CEO David Park leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious and focused. Sarah, we don't just want to hire your consulting firm for another project. We want to acquire your methodology, your team, and your client relationships. We want to bring you in-house as our new sustainable innovation division with full autonomy, your own P&L, and equity participation in everything you build. The number he mentioned made my breath catch, $50 million committed over 5 years, with performance bonuses that could double that amount. Me as division vice president reporting directly to the C-suite, with the authority to hire my own team, set my own strategic priorities, and expand into any markets I identified as promising. You've identified something our entire industry missed, he continued, gesturing to a presentation that included screenshots of news articles about our client successes. We're not just talking about packaging consulting anymore. You've mapped the infrastructure for sustainable business transformation across multiple sectors. Supply chain optimization, regulatory compliance, materials innovation, market positioning, that's worth building an entire division around. The offer wasn't just about money or title. GreenTech was offering me the resources to scale everything I'd built from my studio apartment into a full-service capability that could transform how companies approached sustainability challenges. We've been watching your work for 6 months, added CFO Jennifer Walsh. Your clients are achieving results that our competitors can't match. BioCorp's market share growth, EcoSoft's successful European expansion, Pacific Organics' supply chain cost reductions. That's not luck, that's methodology. We want to scale that methodology across our entire client base. I accepted on the spot, but not before negotiating additional terms: full intellectual property rights to my research methodologies, hiring authority for senior-level positions, and a commitment that GreenTech would never interfere with my strategic decisions as long as the division remained profitable. The contract signing took place the following week in GreenTech's Manhattan headquarters, 37 floors above the street where I used to catch the subway to Morrison & Associates every morning. The press release hit the business journals. On a Thursday morning, former Morrison & Associates analyst launches $50 million division after identifying market opportunity dismissed by previous employer. The article included quotes from several clients, all praising the visionary analysis and practical implementation strategies that had transformed their operations. Marcus Thompson was quoted extensively: "Sarah Chen understood our needs before we fully understood them ourselves." My phone started ringing immediately. Reporters wanting the full story, headhunters from competing firms, former Morrison colleagues suddenly remembering my name. And finally, the call I'd been expecting since the news broke. "Sarah, it's Rebecca Martinez. I saw the news coverage. Congratulations, that's quite an achievement." I was standing in my new corner office on the 34th floor, looking down at Morrison & Associates building 12 blocks away. From this height, it looked smaller than I remembered. "Thank you," I said, keeping my voice neutral and professional. "Listen, I've been thinking about our conversation last year. About sustainable packaging solutions. I realize now that perhaps we didn't give your proposal the consideration it deserved. I wonder if there might be an opportunity for collaboration between GreenTech and Morrison." I let the silence stretch just long enough for her to feel it, the same way she'd made me feel invisible in that boardroom. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and measured. "I appreciate the call, Rebecca, but we're pretty focused on working with partners who understood this market from the beginning. Companies that were willing to take risks when everyone else was playing it safe. Of course, I understand completely. But if you ever reconsider, or if there are smaller projects where Morrison might add value, I'll stick to what I do best," I said, echoing her words back to her with a smile she couldn't see. "Building divisions. Leading strategy. You know, senior-level work." There was a pause. "Right. Well, best of luck with everything." After I hung up, I walked through the GreenTech offices, past teams of analysts and strategists working on projects I'd envisioned while balancing coffee cups and swallowing pride. The sustainable packaging division was already exceeding projections, with 5 major acquisitions planned for the next quarter and expansion into European markets ahead of schedule. My assistant knocked on the door. Yes. I had an assistant now, along with a deputy director and 3 senior managers reporting to me. "Ms. Chen? The quarterly strategy meeting is ready to begin. The board is particularly interested in hearing about the Southeast Asia expansion proposal." I grabbed my portfolio of new market research, not stolen insights or borrowed ideas, but original analysis my team had developed through rigorous methodology and genuine expertise. 26 people waited in the boardroom to hear what I'd discovered, what I'd analyzed, and what I believed we should build next. As I walked toward that meeting, I thought about Rebecca somewhere across the city, probably still trying to figure out how to replicate what I'd built. I thought about Morrison & Associates, still chasing the consulting trends instead of creating them. And I thought about every person who'd ever been told to stick to coffee runs while carrying ideas that could change everything. The boardroom doors opened, and I stepped inside, not as someone fetching beverages or seeking permission, but as someone who'd earned the right to speak and be heard. No coffee runs required. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.